Hi, everyone from around the country, and welcome to today's seminar. Firstly, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. My name is Nancy Kong. I am joint seminar coordinator for the Life Course Center seminars, together with Rennie Lee from UQ. Today, we welcome the speaker, Mark Stevenson. Mark Stevenson is an epidemiologist and a professor of urban transport and public health at the University of Melbourne. His appointment across the Melbourne School of Design, Engineering and Population and Global Health, and is a co-director of the Transport, Health and Urban Design Research Lab at the university. He is a chief investigator and a places program leader in the Life Course Center, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medicine, Medical Sciences, and an advisor for injury to the Director General of the WHO. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed articles, books, book chapters, and reports, and procured more than 70 million in competitive research fundings, including HMRC, ARC, and U.S. National Institute of Health. Mark has worked on numerous national and international projects that have directly influenced transport policy and public health, and has worked with both federal and state government in Australia and internationally. Welcome, Mark, and the floor is yours.
And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today here. If you're calling in from the University of Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, all respects, my respect to their elders past and present and future. So what I'm going to speak today about, or this afternoon, is to look at towards sustainable cities and integrating land use and transport systems. And it may, for many of you who do an enormous amount of research looking at life course, the discharge show of the life course, this may seem a little odd, but I will bring some of those elements into the presentation at the end. But really suffice to say that the way our cities have been designed prohibit in some ways equity of access to services. And I think you'll see some of this through this presentation. And what I have looked at then is to look at ways of how we can enhance our cities to ensure that we can have access and equity in terms of access to really important amenities, and transport is very much at the heart of that. But before we get into the details of some of the modelling that we've done in this area, I just want to give a historical context to how our cities have formed and the role that transport has played in that, and importantly, what effects it has on the health of our population. And it's obviously, it goes back then, and I'm going to take us back to some really interesting studies out of the UK, United Kingdom and cities there, and London in particular. And in this instance, you see here, a fantastic shot of Paris, the city of light. And it's interesting that the Paris that many of you may have visited now certainly wasn't the Paris of the early 1800s. And it really came about as a part of Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte's exile in London, and saw how they were changing London in the early 1800s to deal with the challenges around sanitation. And when he returned to Paris following his exile in London in around the 1840s, he went about destroying much of what Paris was and created what Paris is today. And urban planners and architects now refer to this sort of as sort of, it's like the big build that's occurring here in Melbourne at the moment, where Napoleon sort of demolished many buildings and created parks he created the well-known avenues that many of you may have walked up and down now in Paris. And he enhanced the sanitation. Prior to that, Paris was a very dark and polluted city, and spent equivalent to something like $70 billion on doing this and creating what we know today. And just to give not only just some of the history to that, but the politics and the sociology to it wasn't just done out of the, wanting to have a beautiful, clean city as such. It was done for a whole bunch of reasons. So health was one of the important reasons for why they needed to, and firstly, develop sanitation and remove the squalor and the putrid smells that were emanating everywhere in those cities. But they built the avenues also then for access for the military to be able to quell any conflict that may be arising from the population. So, but also, not only was it the avenues for the military, but it also provided access to horse and cart and allowed movement of goods much more freely than having the very, very narrow alleyways. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that when we look at some of these cities, they weren't just an amorphous mess that rose out of the ground. They in fact actually were planned, and they were planned around delivery of the politics of the day, the health concerns of the day, and also what was needed to ensure that a city survived and had markets and the like. And if we move to look at down under and look at Australia and how it evolved, it was not dissimilar. This is a shot of Collins Street in Melbourne in the 1800s. And what it highlights is this massive street. You can see that it's sufficient that allows a horse and cart to turn. But what also influenced the planning of Melbourne at the time was also health concerns. At the time, we didn't know about the germ theory, which arose really in the 1850s. And up until then, we believed that all disease was transmitted through the putrid smells in the air. And as a consequence of that, and this is called the miasma theory, they designed these cities with great airflow between, going through them. So it would clear those putrid smells that were obviously as a consequence of poor sanitation. So again, even in Melbourne, as similar to Paris in some regards, that the city formed around a bunch of reasons, not just evolving. It was the health concerns of the day. It was the transport concerns, and the ability to have a viable city that would operate with markets. We sort of go from 1800s now to the 21st century. And what we see now are these massive urban agglomerations that have arisen, often though, not with as much planning and foresight that we saw in those early 1800s. But what we have available to us now too are some unique insights as a consequence of big data and the analytical approaches that we can apply to understanding how do we redesign our cities for equitable, healthy, sustainable outcomes. And so with that question in mind, it made me want to look at understanding how does our city interact with the transport modes that we deliver in those cities, and what influence does that have on our health? Importantly, does it really impact our health significantly? And so I set out to answer that question, and I applied what was sort of a health impact assessment framework, where we looked at the form of the city, and we looked at the transport systems in those cities, and we looked at a number of risk exposures to a person's health. We looked at air pollution, and we looked at road trauma, and we looked at obesity and physical inactivity. And we measured all of that in relation to an outcome called health and wellbeing, where we used a metric that's used by the WHO, which is the disability adjusted life year, which takes account of premature years of life lost to a disability or life lost prematurely as a consequence of the environment we're living in. Now, we did a lot of modeling on this, and I know there's many economists in this that would be listening, who would probably love to see the fit of the model and everything else. And I haven't provided that in this presentation. I've kept it as sort of infographics to get the message across. There are a few numbers in it, but not many. But certainly this work has been published in the Lancet Medical Journal in 2016, and some of the other work I'm not is more recent as well. So what I was interested in looking at is, we created a business as usual sort of model where we looked at what was the density and the distance to amenities, to transport and to schools. And we looked at the mixed use of the land use. Were there schools and shops and houses close by? So those are the land use metrics we looked at. We looked at public transport and private vehicle use, cycling and walking. Excuse me. And then we looked at the level of physical activity in those cities. We used a metric called the metabolic equivalent, where we looked at how much energy is expended by the type of transport or exercise you might do. And we looked at the levels of performer as a constant, the road performer as a constant of using the transport systems in most cities, as well as the evolution. What I was looked at, and we looked at 6 cities in the first instance: Melbourne, London, Boston, Delhi, Sao Paulo, and Copenhagen. There was some method to my madness in selecting these cities. One, we wanted some diversity in cities, so we certainly had that. Were southern cities and northern hemisphere cities. We had cities that were deemed middle income, low to middle income cities versus high income cities. We also included Copenhagen, which is sort of renowned for a city that has really designed its cities for sustainability and access, particularly using walking and cycling as the mode of access. And you can see that just in those cities, their land uses are incredibly different. If you're taking Delhi on the one hand and you're taking Melbourne on the other, land use is incredibly different in those cities. So again, very useful cities to select to give us a contrast in the findings. But you also see that there's quite a contrast in the mode choice that you have available in each of those cities. So in Copenhagen, has quite extensive investment in public transport, but there's a lot of cycling and a lot of some car use. Whereas Melbourne and Boston are very car-dependent cities. Delhi, unusually, it has a lot of mixed modes as well. It has a lot of cycling. It does have some public transport, has private vehicle use as well. So once we had set up this model and we worked out how the land use operated and the transport systems and what their current status was in relation to road crashes, air pollution, and physical inactivity, we had our business as usual type scenario. What we were able to do is run a number of scenarios across that model to look at sustainability and access and equity in some regards to services. And so one of them I'm going to talk very briefly about today is what we refer to here as a compact city sort of land use scenario. A compact city is discussed quite often, but it can be just considered as a city of short distances. So a city that you feel that you could arrive in and you could walk around quite easily, or you could ride a bike, or you could actually catch public transport like a tram to and from locations very easily. Can be sort of deemed a city of compact city. There aren't, typically they're probably more well known for many Asian cities of high densities. So what we were looking at here, we modeled a compact city scenario where we reduced 30% of their increase in land use density. We reduced distances to public transport by about 30%. We increased diversity of land use, so the multi-use land use. We had mixed uses such as housing and schools close by and shops by about 30%. And we had a transport policy that supported a 10% mode shift away from private motor vehicle kilometres traveled to cycling and walking. So what we're saying here is this is a scenario we're playing at. But what we're trying to say is if we took the city that you're in now and we were able to build in a greater level of density in proximity to schools and housing, schools and shops and the like, and we were able to have transport policies that advocate for greater sustainability. So we're pushing more towards walking and cycling and provide infrastructure as such. What would we see, particularly health-wise, in those sorts of cities? So this is the model again, just illustrating that scenario. Greater density, housing density, shorter distances between your place of residence or your school and public transport and the like, and then that greater diversity and mixed land use. What we're saying is we're taking 10% out of current vehicle kilometre travel by car and moving it into walking, cycling, or public transit. And what we were interested to look at were what changes it made to some of those risk exposures around physical inactivity, air pollution, and risk exposures around road transport, road traffic accidents. And then ultimately we measured the health and well-being of the population if we were to amend the current state to this state. These are just a few slides illustrating this. This is just showing what happens in relation to air pollution, in this case, particulate matter 10 and 2.5. What happens in terms of what sort of reduction would we see if we were have a transport policy that advocated for this change in modality and in terms of moving out of private motor vehicles onto public transport or walking or cycling. Now, I mean, and this is an equity issue as well, because what we know in relation to air pollution, particularly the most vulnerable populations are greatest exposed to air pollution. And so you can see here by this sort of transition to a more compact city and moving away from very car-dependent type city design, we actually get reductions in air pollution in Melbourne particularly, and in London and Copenhagen and Boston. We don't see that happening as much in Sao Paulo and Delhi, and in what that is in part a result of is that much of the air pollution we're seeing, in particularly in Delhi, is arising out of coal burning stoves and the like, not as much from vehicle emission. But importantly, when we look at modelling all of this as well, what health gain do we see, if any, if we start to change the form of our cities, the compactness of our cities, and provide greater access to amenities for the citizens of those cities? It's a great news story here. Now, what we see is we start seeing considerable gain in health. Now, this metric is what I mentioned earlier, is the disability adjusted life year gain per 100,000 population. So this is a sort of a composite measure. It's not that you're getting 622 more lives or greater years of living, but it's a measure that needs to be taken into account, that it takes account of premature years of life loss and premature years or gained. And so what this is highlighting is these are the sort of premature years or life gained as a consequence of changing this city form. And you can see for every city, it's a positive outcome. In all the numbers, so you can clearly see really the gains are achieved through cardiovascular disease, reduction in that, and also reductions in type 2 diabetes. Interestingly, you do see in Melbourne, Boston and London, you do see increases in road trauma as a consequence of that compact city move and moving people out of cars onto public transport, into cycling and walking. But interestingly, you don't see that negative element occurring as a in Delhi and in Delhi and in Copenhagen. It's almost neutral. I mean, you densify Copenhagen a bit more, you're not going to see increases in road trauma because they've already designed their city for sustainability and equitable access already. And I guess you might ask the question, why do we see that in Melbourne and Boston and Sao Paulo, and particularly London as well, you have these increases in levels of road trauma? And the reason for that is what we're doing in that scenario where we're moving people out of private cars and into public transport and cycling and walking. You are actually making them more vulnerable to road trauma because if the city's not designed for safer access around cycling and walking, then you will increase the levels of trauma, and that's what occurs there. This slide is pretty messy, but what I wanted to highlight here was that there are opportunities for us in cities like Sydney, Auckland, and Melbourne to change our current transport system, our infrastructure, to ensure that if we did move people into cycling and walking, you would mitigate the levels of trauma, but only if you change the roads environment by, here you can see in Melbourne, by upwards of about, for every vehicle kilometre travelled, up to about 55% of the infrastructure would need to be changed to ensure it's safe. So we've got a lot of work to do. So that takes me then to, that's sort of more about traditional modelling that gives some insights around how we can enhance the access and accessibility to services, particularly for vulnerable populations, and enhance our health state as well. But these are some other unique approaches that we've also been undertaking in our research lab to give us some insights around how to better design our cities for healthier outcomes. And we've been predominantly using a lot of big data and artificial intelligence to do this. And I've got a lot of time here, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. But again, I think this is just a really nice project that we recently finished. And again, this one's published in, I think, the Lancet, the journal Lancet Public Health, where we took every city in the world that had a population of 300,000 population, and we looked at their aerial imagery of those cities. And again, we were very interested looking at their public transit. Public transport is a key measure for the general population, particularly those who are socially disadvantaged, to get access to employment. And so we wanted to look at what role the public transit has played in health status of some of the cities that we were looking at and interested in. So we took map images. We were fortunate at the time to be able to get these from Google Maps, and we divided. We took 400 by 400 meter images, snapshots of each city, 1,692 cities, and so we had about 1.6 million images. And they were very high-level abstract images. And these two pictures on the side here illustrate what we took, sort of what they looked like when we had the 400 by 400 meters. So we stripped the images of any names so that you couldn't say, oh, this is a French city because it's got French street names. So we stripped them of names. We stripped them right back. So all we could see was the black of the road network, the orange, that was the public transit, and green and blue space in those cities. So the two snapshots you see there are two of the 1,400 by 400 meter images we had to Paris. We then undertook a neural network type analysis using AI and graph analysis. And this is an output of one of the graph analysis that we undertook of that huge data set. And what we're trying to see here was, do certain cities cluster based on their urban form, based on whether they have their public transport networks, based on their road designs, based on their blue and green space, all things that are really important to key health outcomes that we were interested in looking at. And interestingly, we came up with these 9 distinct clusters that occurred. So if your city fell in cluster 6, it would never be misclassified in cluster 9, just to give you an example of that. And likewise, sort of 8 and 6. And I've just highlighted one here, typology 5. I can't remember what typology 5 was, but it might be the next slide will probably highlight it. Typology 4. So these are the 9 clusters that we came up with. And I think I've just highlighted the motor city cluster. So what we did is, when we came up with these 9 clusters, we then ran some workshops with urban designers and architects and planners to see whether they could say, oh, that's this type of city to the line. So cities that fell into the motor city, for example, really were cities that were of medium to low density. They had a high capacity grid-based type road networks, and they had very medium rail transport. So really what they were cities that had been designed for the car. And interestingly, what I did then is just segregate these out in terms of whether they were Asia Pacific cities, because I've been presenting some of this in the Asia Pacific region. So you can see if we look at Asia Pacific, there's only 12 cities, or about 1.7% of all Asia Pacific cities in the Asia Pacific region fall within that motor city type cluster. And they are cities that are predominantly all of the Australian cities. And I think Auckland met that, and Auckland and Christchurch met that criteria as well. So they highlights that all of our cities have been designed for cars. Whereas other Asian Pacific cities fall into these informal and irregular type clusters. So some have high green space, but no mass transit, so very little public transport and very informal road infrastructure. So they're very low income, healthy cities. And this is another way of presenting it. It's almost a piece of art, this. But I'll just zoom in on sections of it, but what it is looking at, it's looking at those city clusters, but then grouping them by country level. And if we look at that, and I'll just zoom in on these and bring them in so you can see, what it highlights is on the left here, that green should all be the same color. That's when I was putting the slide together, I chose the wrong green color. But what you can see on the left here are all these cities, or these countries, I should say, where their cities all have the same urban form, and using and our artificial intelligence approach, where we're incredibly objective, and it was just using the data from the map. It basically highlighted that every city in those countries had the same urban form. And interestingly, if you look on the right, these are some of the cities that have incredibly diverse, countries that have incredibly diverse urban form in their cities. So if you look at China, for example, here, it has a whole range. I think it has all 9 clusters, and that reflects the urban development that's occurring in the country. So on the east coast of China, you see the Shanghais and the Beijings that are highly developed now, have massive public transport systems. Whereas on the west of the country, cities in the west are very much back on sort of low-income country status of very informal road infrastructure, little access for people, for the population to access services and the like. So just by taking this big global picture, we begin to see some patterns arising out of city form that influences how people live in those cities and get around in those cities, and ultimately what they have access to in those cities. And in fact, not that we have measured disadvantage in these cities, but in fact, probably if we looked at the diversity of disadvantage in those cities, it probably would link very well to what we're seeing here at this macro scale. Now, the area I have worked a lot in as a health outcome is looking at levels of road trauma across countries. And so in this instance, and the slide probably not so applicable to the Life Course Centre, but what I was able to do is to look at the levels of road trauma. So road deaths and serious injury as a consequence of, traveling on the roads. I wanted to look at how varied were the levels of road trauma by the type of city design and by the type of infrastructure that was provided in those cities. So you can see here, cluster 5, there's been a massive amount of infrastructure being built in those cities compared with the low-income cities, which have very little. Cluster 2 has hardly any infrastructure that's being put into the cities. And just to know that that's the level of infrastructure, one might think then that the rates of injury would be probably very low in cities that have massive infrastructure in relation to roads and in relation to public transport and everything else. But interestingly, it doesn't. It does in part, but it's not the entire story. So these lines just reflect the different forms of road trauma. So you can see here the blue at the top is the overall levels of road trauma. So that's road deaths and serious injuries. The green is the pedestrian injury. The black are motorcycle injuries, and the brown is cyclist injury. So you can see ultimately in terms of levels of road trauma, the cluster 5, those cities that have invested in high transit, so a lot of public transport, they have low rates of road trauma. But interestingly, they have almost similar levels of road trauma to the cities that are deemed intense cities. Intense cities are cities that have very high levels of density. So like this is the example of Tokyo. Cities that have high density, but also have invested extensively in public transport for the entire population. And so you see rates that are very low there. And the same applies to much of the cyclist and the pedestrian injury rates also. So if you were to design a city of today now in relation to wanting to ensure that you mitigate the levels of road trauma in that city, you probably would be looking at city designs that reflect this sort of intense cluster type city, because you don't have to outlay as much in terms of infrastructure than you do in these high transit, which are very typical European type cities. So I'm coming to the end of what I'm presenting today, but what I'm really wanting to highlight here is those two different examples, using sort of health impact assessment framework and more traditional modeling, to one where we've used very much a macro view and looked at using neural network analysis, graph analysis, and machine learning to give us insights across the globe. And both of them highlight giving us some insights around how we might better design a more sustainable, more equitable urban form that would deliver in the 21st century. And so in summary, these are some of the points that I'm sort of picked up on in this presentation. Clearly, a mode shift, reduced emissions has massive health gains. So I think that's something we talk a lot in public health around a whole array of interventions that are valuable. But we do talk about cycling, the need for physical activity, but we actually haven't sort of grappled with the idea that actually if we really enhance some sustainable transport solutions, not only are we going to get, reductions in some levels of road trauma, but we're going to reduce emissions, we're going to get greater access to amenity. So as a whole, we're going to see much better health and wellbeing outcomes than we necessarily have thought through before. I've highlighted this, that these new approaches and standardized data are giving us some new insights that we haven't had. This is at a really exciting time in research, but in academia, where we can begin to explore some of these unique insights as a consequence of the sort of growing toolkit that we developed. But finally, I guess the other point is that, how I've presented it today, it makes it all seem quite straightforward, and it's not linear in fashion. It is much more complex. And importantly, we need to understand that interaction of urban system. I think in an academe, we typically, we often work in silos, in our disciplinary silos, and then we also work in our sort of content silos. When in fact, what this research is starting to highlight is that all of these urban systems are interacting, and we need to begin to explore those to understand not only are elements around social disadvantage in society and across the life course, but importantly, what can we do about it? And I think our interventions need to be almost embedded within the local urban system, complex system framework as well. I'll leave it at that. And look, thank you very much for the time.
I was wondering, so this public transport, I'm all really for I think it's very important. I agree with your finding. I just wonder, as an economist, what about the cost of public transport? Does that somewhere taken into account, especially compared to the purchasing power? Some cities, for example, in China, the cost is extremely low. It's 20 cents. Whereas here in Australia, it's relatively more expensive. So I just wonder if that would change the willingness for people to adapt to the public transit, even that we have the set amount of network.
Now, great question, Nancy. It's always good. Look, cost is key to it. And I guess it goes back to my point about understanding the urban systems. The economy is key to all of that. And if we exclude it, then we almost get erroneous findings. in some ways in Australia, our public transport system is subsidised. There, what it is. So on that note alone, that's a challenge. And that's, if you've got X amount of dollars to spend, should you be spending it here or there? We need to know that. We don't know that. And so it would be a valuable point to look at. How do we best deliver, if we have some level of resource, how best to deliver it? And it's one thing, I just had, before this session, I was speaking to a colleague around, doing a little bit of work around micromobility, which is e-bikes and e-scooters. And they have, in terms of the sustainability, they're really important and it could play a really key part in our cities and giving access. I'm particularly interested in looking at transport poverty element of it. But the challenge is, if and you're all in Brisbane, so you would have used Beam or the other, but the cost it's very expensive. So it is probably quite prohibitive. So you might deliver a service, but if it's incredibly expensive, you're obviously just not going to access it. And so that is a challenge. And so we need to take these sorts of findings in line with also what are the economic implications of this, how best to deliver it as well, because it won't work in the absence of it.
Haley Christian has commented in the chat. So she asked if you could comment on how it has been used to influence policy and urban planning practice in different countries and across different government jurisdictions. Yeah.
Great question, Haley. The one that I'm not au fait with. Look, I know that, there's a group, and Billy Giles Corte has led this group at RMIT who are doing a lot, have done a lot in terms of using this as a tool to advocate for a lot of change. To what extent we see the change, I don't know. I think it's a matter of, you get to a point where you can look at this at a macro level and you can say, look, this appears to be the case. But if you seek to change some of that, that's a really difficult path to pursue because it requires a whole lot of players. And I think it's maybe the time frame with it is also a challenge as well. I think we're getting some movement in regards to and really understanding the role of let's say compact cities and the role that they could play in terms of enhanced health outcomes in better environments and access. But I think we've got a lot more to do, and we really. We're chipping away at it, I think, as academics with developing interventions and trialing them and assessing them and evaluating them. But that doesn't mean that gets put into practice at all, if at all. And that's the challenge. So I guess my answer to Haley too is I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's slow. And I think we probably need to be putting more emphasis on sort of implementation research where we really nut out the elements that you just mentioned, Nancy, too. What is the cost? What is it? Is that a barrier to seeing this move forward? Those sort of things we really need to explore more there.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's also important that you work with the state and federal government. I think that's very important to translate the research into policy. So I also have some comments basically. So when I went to Tokyo, I was really, really impressed by that city. It's like no other, I've never seen such a big city in such a big scale, so busy, but so clean. And what surprises me is that the public transit, it's definitely one of the top thing. Another thing is there's no garbage bin anywhere on the street and people just don't litter at all. I find there's a lot of culture, kind of a collective culture in this Japanese culture or Asian culture in general. And I think that kind of policy would not particularly work in another country. So I just wonder if similar things could be applied to some other things. So for example, people, whether they use public transit, it could be cultural, could be climate related, could be the socioeconomic, definitely. And another thing is pandemic. For example, COVID, during COVID times, people are so cautious of not using public transit. So So I just wonder if there's any kind of a particular specific city or specific variables that we need to take into account in this.
Again, Nancy, great question. I think we need to take all variables into account. I mean, the reality is, you might review. I mean, I guess this piece of work is what's valuable about it is it is contrasting cities globally, and I think that's what's a real value. There's a real utility in doing that, but it's not providing a solution for that city and that country because you do need to take account of the political situation. You need to take account of the culture, the climate, the whole array of factors. Whether it's sort of a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, all of those are important in each of those countries and cities. So, you really need to be operating within the environment that you are in to see if you can change some of those elements, I think. But I think this gives us a perspective of it. I mean, if I think, I'm very focused on sustainability and climate change, and it does need a movement to get that happening, as we all know. But, recent findings, around the public's perception of whether they would, are actually doing something now to mitigate climate change. It runs at about 5% of the population. So, so you've got to take those sorts of elements into account as well. Sustainability, and if I focus around really sustainable transport, it doesn't mean that that's something that the general populace are all focused on as well, or be interested in. So, to get a movement, it takes an enormous amount of work. And I often think, as the academic and doing the research, we're just one part, very, very much one part of that. And it takes a very skilled, I think, person and group to move this in a direction that is favorable for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Alicia Young commented, asking you if your projects touches on diverse requirements for access. No, it doesn't. And again, really good, really important question, and one that's been neglected too often. No, our modelling is very macro focused, so it's not getting down to access or particularly diverse populations and disability, for example. So it doesn't look at that, but a really important area that is too. I guess we kept asking a lot of from the demand side, whereas I think this is a lot from the supply side. So I guess another thing, from economist perspective, again. So I was thinking, what we often do is to have this fixed effects, basically controlling for city-specific fixed effects and looking for before and after. So I just wonder, I'm really fascinated about your Google Map data, this 400 times 400. That's amazing. Would we be able to, or would you be able to get before, after, because Google Map has been taking photos for many years, could we get before and after and actually see the changes within the same city in this road trauma and things like that?
You could. You need certainly a certain lot. It depends on what phenomena you're looking at and how dynamic it is. So we have done that for air pollution, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic and during, and we published in atmospheric research on that, showed the relationships. So you could do it for something that's quite dynamic, like air pollution that's changing all the time. But for something like if you live in a motor city, that infrastructure takes a long time to change and move. So, it would take a period of time. But you certainly could, looking at the phenomena, depending on the phenomena you're interested in looking at. But yeah, and I guess it's getting harder and more expensive to access that information. We started doing this when we could download the information ourselves, but now that's been restricted as well. So it's a bit more challenging.
Yeah, I see. Maybe have to be some case studies, such as for example, Vancouver putting in a lot of cycling lanes, had a big infrastructure change. Toronto was smart city, things like that. So maybe it needs to be case study. So Haley, commented again. It says, sorry again for the loaded question. How we can have a significant role to play here as a COE and through the WHO initiative to bring life course focus research centers across the globe together. Implementation and translation in this research area is a challenge and an opportunity because we can come at this from multiple angles, with disadvantage being the common thread.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, there's just a lot we could do. I mean, and we're looking to people like Haley to do it. I don't mean to be facetious there. Look, there's a lot that we could do here too, and there are fora that people are coming together around. I guess the important element I would say here is that we can fall back into the disciplinary groupings that we are all very familiar with, and what is needed here is very much to deal with what is complexity, a group of disciplinary backgrounds and experience to come to play a part in this, to map out how the economy operates when there's significant disadvantage in a city and when there's no public transport, and how do we resolve that, and how do we all those sorts of big questions. They can be worked on, and I guess what I'm enjoying to see now, younger colleagues, they're actually doing a lot of agent-based modeling where policy scenarios and synthetic populations can be developed, which allows us to begin to explore some of these complex questions and look at multiple inputs and outputs. And I think that's an exciting element, and maybe, Haley, that's something that could be a way of bringing some of this to the table to begin to look at disadvantage across the life course.
Yeah, Alicia agrees, said interdisciplinary collaboration are definitely the way forward, and center like a life course center really bring this opportunities into life. I think that's it's great. Any other questions?
Just maybe a plug on that. We're sort of proposing to do that in the Places program around housing, social housing, where we're bringing lots of people around the table and using it and developing up synthetic population, agent-based models, and to run through some important questions. So it is around a content area, but I think the potential could be much bigger than that.
Yeah. Social housing. I would love to hear about that more. Maybe next seminar, next seminar. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark. This is a very, very interesting, and thank audience for the participation as well. So if anyone would like to do a seminar, please contact me or Rennie from UQ. And thank you so much. Hope everyone have a great day.